Right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be giving everyone a couple minutes to join, but thank you for being here today. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm here with Eduardo, who's going to be giving a lecture called Beyond Hispanic, Languages and Cultures in Latin America. This event is being sponsored by the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Health Equity for the Health System and Hopkins Familia Employee Resource Group in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. Before we begin, I wanted just to briefly introduce you all to Hopkins Familia. Hopkins Familia is a forum for employees who share an affinity for Hispanic or Latinx issues and communities. And our mission is to provide professional development and networking opportunities for members and allies of the Hispanic and Latinx community. We have 3 pillars: workforce, community, and patient care. We want to enhance employee engagement and professional development for our Latinx employees, faculty, and staff. We want to address challenges and build our Latinx communities. We want to advocate for equal treatment of Latinx patients and clients. I am one of the co-chairs of Hopkins Familia with Wilson Lammy, and I really love being part of Hopkins Familia because it's an opportunity to be part of enterprise change and impact our communities. There's a lot of value, and leadership really supports these initiatives. So if you have any ideas or things you want to do to change the community or improve the experience of our Latinx patients, I encourage you to join We have a lot of open positions on leadership, or you can just join as a member. We're also having some other events if you're interested in joining. Latinos Beyond the Real, which is a documentary that faces stereotypes about Latinos in the media. Latinx Identities, where some of our own Latino employees will be discussing their experiences and how being part of this community has impacted their lives and careers. And we're also going to have a lecture and panel discussion supporting the Latinx community during COVID-19 and what Hopkins has been doing specifically to help this community during this pandemic. None of these initiatives would be possible without our co-sponsors, Inez Stewart and Pablo Selnick, who support Hopkins Familia, and of course, our Chief Diversity Officer, Shrita Golden, who is here today. And I'm gonna pass over the mic for her to say a few words.
So good afternoon. I just wanted to welcome you to our launch event for Hispanic Heritage Month, and just want to thank April and Wilson for all of their hard work as the co-chairs of Hopkins Familia. Their dedication is truly inspirational. And you know, as April pointed out, one of the important things that our employee resource groups do are really bring the issues and concerns of our Latinx community as well as our patients to our office so that we can advocate to our leadership for the needs that the community has. And so because of many of the concerns that were brought to us by our Latinx and Hispanic employees about interpretation services for our patients, you know, that's really been really central and instrumental in helping to centralized language services, which now falls under Tina Tolson. And in some of our subsequent programs throughout the month, you'll hear about how some of the really excellent ideas you brought to us have really been operationalized. So I want to turn the program back over now and just thank you all for participating and for your engagement with this.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. And with that, we're going to just dive into our presentation. I'll pass the mic to Eduardo, who has a really great talk. I have actually heard it, and it's very informative and changing.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Click to start the mouse keyboard control. All right. Okay. Yes, my name is Eduardo Ribeiro. I'm going to talk briefly about myself and my experience, and then I will jump into the presentation itself. Here's a map of our continent, the Americas. And most of it is also Latin America, where both Portuguese and Spanish are spoken. I happen to be from Brazil, so not officially a Spanish-speaking country. We speak Portuguese there, but both languages are very similar. And of course, I always had a very big affinity for the the Spanish language and the Hispanic cultures. All right. So about me, I was born and raised in Brazil, like I said. I used to be a journalist. That's my major in college. And I was working in a newspaper in my hometown when I got an invitation to join a project that, still in college, a project to work on describing an indigenous language from the Amazon. So I figured our indigenous languages were endangered. Many of them were disappearing without being documented. And there were way too many journalists, so I decided to switch to linguistics. And that's what I got my master's in linguistics in Brazil. So I've been doing research among indigenous groups of the Brazilian Amazon. I came to the US to study linguistics at the University of Chicago, where I got a PhD in linguistics with a dissertation on Carajá, which is a language spoken in the southern part of the Brazilian Amazon. That picture shows me, you know, a long time ago, much younger, working with a Carajá elder, interviewing her for the language documentation project. Right. Right. Sorry about that. Am I controlling the slides, or they're controlling themselves? Right. Yeah. Yep, I also work as a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian for 2 years. That was the duration of the fellowship. And I've been a medical interpreter for 15 years, first as a freelance interpreter, and I've been as a full-time interpreter at Bayview for the past 2 years and counting. First, clarification on terminology. Hispanic is a cultural, linguistic, and historical concept, not a race. Many times people say, well, what race is he? And that is a question that most Hispanics will have difficulties answering, because essentially most of Latin America population is very mixed. So we may have different ethnic backgrounds, even though we all may call ourselves Latinos to unify, or Hispanics to unify. So not all Latinos are Hispanic. Latino is an abbreviation of Latino Americano, Latin American. So it includes also Brazilians who speak mostly Portuguese. So I am technically by birth and race, I am Brazilian, so I'm Latino, but not technically Hispanic, even though, like I said, I always had a big affinity for the language and cultures of our Hispanic neighbors. Not all Hispanics are Latino. Like I said, Latino is an abbreviation. It's a short way of saying Latino Americano. So even if you are Hispanic because you speak the Spanish language, like you're from Spain, you're not technically Latino Americano. Not all Hispanics are Spanish. That's some other confusion that you often get. People say, hey, I have a patient here who's Spanish and he needs interpretation. Well, most likely that person is not going to be Spanish. He's going to be Latino Americano. So it's going to be Hispanic, but not Spanish. Spanish are strictly speaking people from Spain in Europe. So again, Hispanic is someone from a Spanish-speaking country, including Equatorial Guinea. That's something that many Spanish speakers don't realize, that in Africa, there is a country where Spanish is an official language, and that's Equatorial Guinea. And of course, people from Spain are also Hispanic. But it excludes Brazil. Latino, like I said, includes Brazil. In Spanish, someone from Spain. Now, a term that you don't use very often, but sometimes you still do, and you'd still hear and tends to be confused with Latino, is Latin. And growing up, every time I heard the word Latin or Latino in that sense, was to refer to, movie sex symbols like Marcello Mastroianni, who's Italian, Alain Delon, who's French, and of course, Antonio Banderas. And as a joke, I put, well, maybe Julius Caesar can also be called Latin because he spoke Latin, and the Pope because, the Vatican's official language is Latin. So maybe he's also not only Hispanic, Latino, but he's also Latin. He's certainly Latino and Hispanic because he's from Argentina. So he's from a neighboring country of mine. And of course, he speaks Spanish, and he was born and raised in Argentina. Okay, still talking. I chose this picture of Buica, who's a very talented Spanish singer, because first, she's not your typical, when people talk about Latinos, they tend to have a very specific image in mind, or even like Hispanic, they have a very specific image in mind. And Buica is from Spain. She was born in the Balearic Islands in the southern part of Spain, in the Mediterranean Sea, from parents who migrated from Equatorial Guinea. So in my experience working as an interpreter at Bayview, I've worked with patients from every single country where Spanish is spoken, except Equatorial Guinea. So I was looking for people from Equatorial Guinea that could illustrate, them being also Hispanic. And of course, Buica was there all the time. She sings, of course, in Spanish, in European variety of Spanish, in an area that tends to be Catalan tends to be spoken there more often in the Balearic Islands, but she sings in Spanish. So the way I look is the way many Hispanics look. If I happen to look Mexican, Puerto Rican, Colombian, or Honduran, depending on the eye of the beholder, that's because we all tend to share the same colonial combo. I like to call it the colonial combo because we are a mixture to different degrees of Iberian, African, and indigenous genes. Some places you're going to have a prevalence of one, and some places a prevalence of others. Brazil being such a large country, we have a little bit of everything. So I would say the people in the Amazonian region in Brazil tend to look more like your typical Mexican because of the high influx of indigenous blood. while people on the coast of Brazil, especially in places like Bahia, tend to look more Caribbean, because that's where we got the most people from Africa. So many times, people don't even ask. I find it interesting because I used to live in Upper Fells Point for a while, and there used to be, or there still are, many Latinos living there, and people wouldn't even ask if I'm Mexican, but what part of Mexico I'm from. And for me, when Mexicans say that, I feel proud actually for being included. Like I said, Brazil has a very heavy presence of people of African descent, myself being one of them. If you take a look at this map that shows the influx of people being brought from Africa as slaves to the Americas, Brazil is the one that received most of those people, and then the Caribbean, and then the United States. So, of course, we all owe a lot to this African heritage, and we carry it in our bloods and in our languages and in our daily lives. Cultural diversity at Bayview. In my personal experience, like I was saying, I've worked with patients from every single country where Spanish is spoken, except Equatorial Guinea so far, because you never know. They're predominantly from Central America, especially Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Ecuador, followed by Mexico and Dominican Republic. That's, again, based on my personal experience. Many are members of indigenous communities who preserved pre-Columbian languages such as Mam, Quiché from Guatemala, Nahuatl and Mixteco from Mexico, Kichwa from Ecuador, and Garífuna from Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. I chose to speak specifically about these underrepresented groups and often overlooked groups, because many people tend to talk about indigenous peoples in the Americas as something from the past. Oh, they used to do that, they lived this way, and they spoke these languages. But no, they're still a thing of the present, mostly to their own resiliency and to their strength, because they were put through too much throughout colonization, throughout the centuries. So one thing that I like to remind people is that when you talk about Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas, for instance, they are not, again, something from your past and only from your history books. If you're walking around Highlandtown or any other neighborhood in Baltimore where there is a heavy presence of quote-unquote Hispanics, you're going to see people who actually speak languages from the famous pre-Columbian civilizations, the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas. The Kichwa, the many people who speak Kichwa that we see in Baltimore and we see at Bayview, that language traces back to the Inca Empire. Same thing, the people who speak Nahuatl, also that was the most widespread language of the Aztec Empire. And there are several Mayan languages still being spoken today by people who are direct descendants of the people who built those beautiful cities in the Guatemalan and Mexican and Honduran jungle, and Belize too. Again, about cultural diversity at Bayview. Many of these indigenous cultures and languages left contributions to our general culture. So for instance, one example is the word chocolate, not only the word chocolate, but chocolate itself, which is of pre-Columbian origin. It was, invented and made by indigenous people from what we call Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is that part in between southern Mexico and northern Central America. So it's not just in one continent, it's partially in North America, because Mexico, contrary to popular belief, is actually in North America, and part of it is in Central America. And it's usually used to refer to this civilization area where the Mayans and the Olmecs and the Aztecs were and are, their descendants are to this day. So the word chocolate comes from Nahuatl, and the word cacao, that in English people tend to use more cocoa, comes from the Mayan languages. And I put that example, that's one glyph from the Mayan writing system, which is one of the most fascinating writing systems ever developed, in my opinion. And it was the only full-fledged writing system developed in the Americas before the European invasion. If there's time and anybody has any questions about this, we can come back to this. Although some of these languages, these indigenous languages, are related, for instance, Mam and Quiche both belong to the Mayan family, as I had mentioned, many are as different from one another as, say, English and Chinese. They may contain loan words from Spanish, just as English has many from French and Latin and Spanish, but are fully independent languages, just as in the United States, Navajo and Cherokee. Indigenous languages are languages, not dialects. That's something that I like to emphasize. Many times, people say, oh, hey, this person is having trouble communicating in Spanish because they speak a dialect. Even if that person herself is saying, yo hablo un dialecto, we have to take into consideration that this is a prejudice that has been internalized for centuries of colonization. The same way original religions were considered by the Europeans superstition, cults, sects. Original languages were not to be given the status of a language. They were called dialects. So it's the kind of terminology that reflects a lot of colonial prejudice, and we should all try to avoid. The presence of indigenous people in Baltimore and elsewhere is a testament to their 5 centuries of resistance. Indigenous peoples have been victims of massacres, enslavement, and discrimination to this day. Their physical and cultural survival is a testament to their resiliency. But of course, 5 centuries of colonial oppression leaves its mark. So many indigenous languages not only became extinct, but most of them have an increasingly endangered status. In Brazil, for instance, we have more than 150 indigenous languages, but most of them are extremely endangered. I've worked with a language that now has only 5 speakers, a result of the same situation that has repeated itself over and over throughout the past 5 centuries in the entire American continent. Massacres, both intentional and by the spread of diseases, taking away their land and their survival resources and so forth. This is an article that I illustrate my talk mostly with articles from widely available sources to not make it too academic and to show that, this information is available everywhere. But it's important to be interested in seeking them and learning more about the people we work with. And this article illustrates one of the reasons why indigenous languages are endangered. It's discrimination. Speaking an indigenous language was always seen in colonial mentality as a sign of inferiority. So if you spoke an indigenous language, you would be automatically considered backwards and underdeveloped and so forth. So there was so much discrimination, and there still is so much discrimination that people tend to prefer abandoning their original language. And now, linguists and especially the indigenous peoples are trying to catch up and bring back many of their cultural elements that have been forgotten or hidden for such a long time. I'll focus on 3 specific people because they have their own linguistic identity and their own historical and ethnic identity, even though in our statistics, they will be generally considered just as Hispanic. Of course, they will mostly consider themselves Hispanics too, but that's not the end of the story. They're Hispanic plus something else, and that's why the title of my talk is Beyond Hispanic. In Bayview, I've worked with people who are from the Garífuna ethnic group, mostly from Honduras, but there are also Garífuna people in Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. They are descendants from African survivors of a shipwreck who later mixed with local Indians in San Vicente in the Lesser Antilles and adopted their language, which belongs to Arawak, a language family from South America. As a South American and as a South Americanist, or someone who studies indigenous cultures and languages from South America, I'm really, I cannot hide how proud I am of this, because of all the languages spoken in the Caribbean, they were all of South American origin, the ones spoken in the islands. And most of them went extinct during the colonial period, the only survivor is Garífuna, because it was learned by these people of African descent, and it was brought to the coast of Central America, to Honduras, and then spread to neighboring countries. So the ancestors of the Garífuna would eventually be deported from San Vicente to the Central American coast, initially Honduras, from where they spread to Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And there is a significant presence of Garífuna people in New York. And they still, most of them, I would say, preserve, or many of them, preserve their original language, which is originally a South American language. Many people, even people from those countries who are not Garífuna, they would think that they speak an African language, but it's actually a language that they learned from their allies, the indigenous people from the Caribbean, and they preserved it to this day. There are even radio shows in Garífuna, which I find fascinating, from New York. This map shows the saga of the Garífuna. So they started from 1635 on the west coast of Africa, as most enslaved people brought to the Americas to be slaves in sugarcane plantations or other plantations. But the ships in which they were being transported wrecked near San Vicente, which is an island in the southern part of the Lesser Antilles. And then they began to mix with the local Carib Indians. Even though they're called Carib Indians, they spoke a language of the Arawak family. And then the British conquered the Garífuna, imprisoned them, and more than half perished. But the ones who survived were brought to, were finally deported, mass deported to the coast of Central America. Initially an island called Roatan, and that's why April 12th, 1797 was when they were brought, and that's the Garífuna arrival day. It's a celebration among Garífunas. And then they moved to Trujillo, and they kept on moving around the Caribbean coast of Central America. And they're still there to this day. Please remember this name, Roatan, because nowadays the Garífuna, as many other indigenous people from the Americas, are suffering with an authoritarian government that's trying to take away their rights to their land, that have been arresting and oppressing their leadership and so forth. So in Roatan, an island that, you know, it's theirs, now there are real estate development projects that threaten to take their traditional lands away from them. Kichwa is a language, like I said, from Ecuador. It's from the mountains of South America, from the Andes mountain chain. It traces back to the Inca conquest of the highlands of Ecuador. Most of the people from Ecuador that we have at Bayview, they are from the Cañar province. If you look online, you're going to see that the most important Inca monuments in Ecuador are found in the town of Ingapirca, which means the Incas' wall. And even the Spanish spoken in the mountains of Ecuador is influenced by Kichwa. One example is something that we linguists call yeísmo. If you remember from your Spanish lessons, the double L in Spanish tends to be pronounced either as je or as ya. But by people in the mountains of Ecuador, and I suppose Peru, but I only have concrete experience from Ecuador, they pronounce them as lia, which is the original way in which it was pronounced. You still find that pronunciation in Spain, but in Latin America, you only find in areas that were influenced, or you tend to find it only in areas that were influenced by the language of the Incas, which is Kichwa. In Peru, the same language is called Quechua. There are dialectal differences, but it's essentially the same language, or at least it has the same origin. And that's the typical way that Andean people, dress up in festive occasions, and that's llama, or as they would say, llama. Remember the double L? Even in a small country, and I don't want to, like I was saying, I don't want to offend anyone from Ecuador, but compared to its neighbors, it's kind of small. But still, there's so much diversity, so much cultural diversity and linguistic diversity in there. And you can see this central area that's like orange and pinkish and yellowish. That's where most of these Kichwa speakers come from. And Quiche. Quiche is a Mayan language from southern Mexico and mostly from Guatemala. The most famous pre-Columbian book, which is a sacred book called Popol Vuh, was written in this language. It was written in post-colonial times using the Latin alphabet, the Spanish writing system, but it was preserved in the original language. So it's excellent that this was preserved, despite all the attempts by the Spanish colonizers to, destroy indigenous culture. You probably have heard about, priests in the beginning of the colonization of Mexico and Central America destroying original Mayan books because they thought it was all a thing of the devil and all superstition that went against Catholic teachings. And the same priest that actually ordered the destruction of so many books in the Yucatan Peninsula, for instance, is the one that in the end provided some of the keys to decipher the indigenous, the writing system of the Maya, something that I'm fascinated about, as you can notice, but we can talk more about it if we have time later. So one of the several Mayan peoples who developed an advanced civilization in the highlands of Guatemala and southern Mexico, including a very advanced writing system, and I find it very beautiful as well. These are some Quiche people in the market in Guatemala. All right, cultural awareness in healthcare. That's something that I think all of us, especially based on my experience at Bayview, providers and everybody else seem to value quite a lot, to be aware of cultural differences in order to assure more equity in healthcare and especially a better outcome and to avoid some dangers from miscommunication between providers and patients. My joke about beyond Vick's Vaporub, because Vick's Vaporub is one of those cure-all things in Hispanic, Latino culture. Of course, it's used for respiratory ailments, but it's also used for skin rashes. And I've heard so many different uses that I'm sure the makers of Vick's Vaporub never had envisioned. But there's way more than that, because as you can see, there's so much cultural diversity in Latin America, and everybody who migrates here brings some of that with them. And it's important to be aware of those differences when you are providing healthcare to them. I like to repeat this, that un poquito is not enough. It's to say that it's very important to create an environment, a friendly environment, and many times a little bit of Spanish goes a long way in making small talk. But when you have an interaction that requires a little more expertise, you have to have a deep language knowledge and a deep cultural understanding, especially in a medical setting. As Spanish medical interpreters, we are quite aware of how a single word may differ in meaning depending on the geographical origins of the speaker, among other things. And we are continuously learning. That's something fascinating about being a medical interpreter, especially in a diverse environment like the Bayview community, is that every day you're learning something new. When before the pandemic and all that, we would meet often, myself and our fellow interpreters, and we would exchange what we had learned that day, the word of the day. And whether you're a native speaker or not, every single day you're learning something new, and that's fascinating. And that helps a lot in providing the right interpretation, the right understanding between providers and patients. There are many things that as a linguist also I find fascinating is the way the language is changing, and it will change, it will keep on changing, no matter how much conservative language teachers will frown upon, right? One example is that many of our patients, when they refer to a pain in the hand or a pain in the foot, they may be referring to the entire arm and to the entire leg. That is a linguistic development in there. So many times if the provider hears the patient saying mano and the interpreter translates translated as upper limbs, lower limbs, is because the interpreter probably knows that that's what the patient is referring to by the way he's using his body language and all that. So there are those small things that may end up making a big difference. So we take notes and we learn on a daily basis on those small differences between the Spanish spoken in so many different countries. And of course, there are also different folk perceptions of medical care. One thing that I always like to mention is the care of the umbilical cord, of the umbilical stub that the babies are sent home with. When I was growing up, I remember the ladies in my neighborhood, they would take a lot of measures to assure that belly button was well cured and was well taken care of. And you know, many times the patients are surprised to learn that just don't put anything on it, keep it dry, it will fall off and everything will be okay. Because usually you think you have to do certain certain treatments to make sure it will dry correctly and fall correctly, and you have going to have a baby with a nice little ombligo. Yeah, there are many different folk perceptions of medical care that need to be also be brought to attention sometimes when there are signs of misunderstanding. Many of our community members take medications that are available in Hispanic stores, for instance, and are not necessarily, you know, the doctors are not necessarily familiar with them. There are patients who even take injections that they prescribe themselves because it's a tradition, it's a habit that one has back in our countries where health services, professional health services are not necessarily readily available. So we also have to be aware of that. And of course, there are many cultural disparities in referring to reproductive health, the way diseases need to be controlled and so forth. This became a classic of misunderstanding in a medical setting. It's I think it's also in the training that was produced for Hopkins staff on how and when to call for an interpreter. It's the example in which relying on a family member to interpret resulted in a very bad outcome because of the difference in meaning between the word intoxicated in English and the word intoxicado in Spanish. One means basically under the influence, and the other one in Spanish means basically poisoned. So those are very, even though they are, you know, obviously cognate words, they have the same origin, they developed very different meanings in both languages. So it's just an example of how things can go terribly wrong if you don't have a professional interpretation available. But of course, not everything is just cautionary tales. There are also tales of success that are due to local traditions. For instance, in my experience, again, my personal experience in Bayview is that most of our patients from the highlands of Ecuador, Kichwa-speaking patients, tend to go for full breastfeeding of their babies. While many patients from other areas will either combine both or rely mostly on the bottle and so forth. And that's because it's a very strong tradition among indigenous people in those areas. It's, as you can see, that's how it is in Ecuador. We have statistics to discuss if we had the time. Ecuador actually wanted to pass a resolution at the World Health Organization about the value of breastfeeding. But back in the day, apparently, the US weren't very supportive of that measure. Now, we cannot talk about immigrants without talking about the reasons why they migrate. We cannot talk about cultures without talking about history, and history has a lot of politics involved, even if we wanted to avoid it. So it's to speak of Latino presence in the West, and particularly at Bayview, it is important to acknowledge the reasons that trigger migration, including social inequality, political instability, recurrent violence, and the current humanitarian crisis in Honduras that I had mentioned. But you know, there are similar crises going on in other countries of Central America too, and South America as well, even though we don't have necessarily a high number of patients from that area. I wanted to pause here for a second to talk a little bit about myself again, but it's because it's illustrative. Even though I came to the US, my history as an immigrant is not very similar to the history of most immigrants. I came here with papers, with a student visa to pursue, my doctoral degree. I'm also, besides emigrating from another country, there's also a lot of my internal migration. And I descend from people who had to migrate internally in Brazil because of the same reason that lead people to leave their countries: poverty, natural disasters, political violence, and so forth. So on my mother's side, people had to migrate from the Northeast, which is the poorest region in Brazil, in order to seek a better life. And of course, in my father's side, they migrated from the southeast all to central Brazil, where there was a development boom at the time. And that's why I was born in a place that both of my parents were born at. So being able to stay put throughout generations, that is a privilege that many people take for granted. But unfortunately, it's not the same thing everywhere. Here it shows that it's not just a matter of being poor. It's the way poverty is and inequality is in certain countries. If you look at this list, this table with the development index in the Americas, in Latin America, you can see that, not coincidentally, 3 of the countries that are most well represented among our community are at the bottom of the list. El Salvador is there, Guatemala is there, Honduras is there. And the reasons why: political instability. Honduras had a coup d'etat not too long ago, and the consequences of the coup d'etat are still being felt nowadays. There are, protesters, just very similar to what's going on in the US right now, but protesters are being, attacked, are being arrested, they're being hurt by the government. And like I said, indigenous people are always take the blunt of those kinds of crises, both environmental crisis, sanitary crisis, political crisis. Indigenous people tend to. And that's what's going on with the Garífuna now. There were some Garífuna leaders that were disappeared several months ago. And as far as I know, the people have still not heard from them or about them yet. The people who are migrating now, many of them, they've been on the road for a while. Sometimes it's a generational thing. I remember when I presented this talk the first time, and now it's been updated for the current situation, but when I presented the first time, there were 2 children that had just died in separate occasions, separate places, different families, but both children were from Guatemala, and they died under border control custody, I would say. And they were both indigenous people, indigenous children from Guatemala. And indigenous people, many of them who were displaced by civil war back in the 1980s, many of them still didn't go back to their homelands. And one of those children who died is from one of those families. Indigenous people were massacred during civil war in Guatemala. And they tend to be in many countries when there is a combination between political unrest and authoritarian rule and military rule. And we can dwell on this, but I just wanted to suggest some sources. We can talk about them later. Is that many of these situations are due to meddling from other countries into Latin American affairs. Many dictatorships that were supported by some American politicians and regimes, and that has created all sorts of consequences. So people have to think many times when they're asking what reason brings people all the way from Guatemala here, from El Salvador, from Honduras, and so forth. They have to take a look at our own history as North Americans, as US people, and see to which extent our governments had any culpability in that situation. And also last year when I presented this talk, it had been just, I think, a month since the massacre in El Paso. And people were killed by a supremacist because of the way they looked. They looked like me. They look like many of our patients. They look Hispanic, or as that person would put it, Mexican. And so much has happened in the past year that now, more and more people, including people in positions of power, are admitting that racism is also a health crisis. It's a public health crisis. And we have to take that into consideration when we are providing health care to people who have traditionally been disenfranchised in their countries, to avoid that the same happens when they come here. Now, indigenous peoples in times of pandemic. Like I had mentioned before, indigenous people tend to take the blunt of social, political, environmental, and sanitary crises. During dictatorships in Guatemala, as I've mentioned, there were massacres upon massacres. In Brazil, there were, bombings of indigenous villages and disappearance of many, many indigenous people. Chile and so forth with Pinochet. And now, the thing is that it's a cyclic thing. And now, for instance, in Brazil, our current government has it's an enemy of indigenous people, and has promised to not allow them to get any land that they have the right to. And the environmental crisis that you can see on your TVs in Brazil, the burning of the Amazon, but not only the Amazon, but the swamplands and the savanna areas. That may seem an accident, but it's a way of clearing the land, much of it indigenous land for agriculture. So it's something that unfortunately keeps on happening. In Chile, also, since last year, there has been a lot of protesting against inequality, and indigenous people are at the forefront of those protests. I put that picture there because I think it's very illustrative, and it's a beautiful picture of defiance by the Mapuche Indians. That flag at the top of the monument is a Mapuche flag being held by a Mapuche Indian, protesting inequality and the mistreatment of indigenous people in Chile. And that is still going on. Many Chilean protesters were hurt and lost their vision because of rubber bullets that were shot directly at their faces. So there are crises everywhere. Not all of them have consequences in our population, because some countries are just very far away to have mass migration to the US. But it's something that I think it's important to be aware of. Traditionally marginalized and disenfranchised, indigenous people have been at the forefront of protests which erupted last year in Ecuador. These Kichwa speakers I'm talking about, in Chile, and now in Bolivia as well, that the current government has publicly professed that they don't care much about indigenous culture, and indigenous people are the ones that are protesting the most. Bear in mind that countries like Bolivia have a largely indigenous population. So having a government that's mostly white and mostly cherishes European culture, it goes against the interests of those traditional people from those countries that have already suffered enough. There is growing awareness, thank God, that African Americans and Hispanics are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Indigenous populations that we don't hear much about here and elsewhere are also among those most severely affected. I found this source, and they seem to be updated every month, about basically the color of COVID, how it affects different ethnic groups in the US. But much of the data can be extrapolated if you take into consideration that many of our patients who are usually labeled as Hispanics are also indigenous. So they are, doubly threatened by this epidemic. That's the color of coronavirus. Is from the American Public Media Research Lab. They seem to release a report every month. So this one is recent. It's from last week. And this is a quote from the article that was co-written by an indigenous North American woman. Even as the vulnerability of indigenous populations to COVID-19 becomes apparent, they have already been left out of the first wave of relief. Addressing the needs of indigenous populations is challenging because of their invisibility from the consciousness of the majority populations. And that is not, unfortunately, just a North American phenomenon. It's not just a US phenomenon. It's all over. In my native Brazil, indigenous people are being disproportionately affected. And because the populations are already so small, and because most of the victims are elders, that also endangers their indigenous culture even more. Some languages are down to very few speakers. So if the elders die, most of the language dies with them. And if they die, most of the culture dies with them. And that's the situation we're facing right now all over Latin America. If, the environmental situation wasn't bad enough with the fires and all that. So there are, plenty of sources out there if you want to go a little deeper on this. This article by Steve Schwartzman that I chose, it's because Steve Schwartzman is an anthropologist, a North American anthropologist who also got his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago. And he was he worked with an indigenous group in Brazil in the beginning of their contacts with the Brazilian government and the Brazilian society. And that led to almost their extinction because of diseases and all that. So they managed to recover populationally, and now they are again endangered and threatened by the COVID-19 and the poor government response to COVID-19 in Brazil. And there's plenty and plenty of information about the situation, but this article from the Los Angeles Times, I think, is important to mention because, it's an American newspaper about people who are similar to our populations at Bayview, indigenous Mexicans and Guatemalans who have no access to vital information about the pandemic in their indigenous language. So I know of groups in California that provide interpretation services in those indigenous languages. They're community-based groups, and that helps a lot. I don't know, I haven't heard of that kind of initiative in Baltimore, but it's something to look into. Yep, and in many places, indigenous people are setting up their own sanitary barriers by preventing people from entering their villages and their territories. Of course, in order to do that efficiently, you got to have also political power, and that's something indigenous people all over tend to not have, but they try. They try. There are groups in indigenous villages in Brazil, for instance, who have been trying that, but people shoot at them, and again, they're putting themselves at the forefront again of combating this. And another example from Guatemala, in which indigenous people and from Honduras, in which indigenous people and Afro-Honduran people are uniting to combat the pandemic. Those are, the Garífunas and other indigenous communities from there. And an article from the Deutsche Welle, and my German doesn't exist, so, but it's the public radio of Germany, about the situation on how the coronavirus is affecting indigenous people and is threatening with their extinction. Well, if there is still time, we can talk about some possible additional topics on the need for community-based language services. For instance, I think one of the things that really makes me grateful for working at Bayview is the fact that we get to know our communities, and that certainly has some very positive consequences in our job and in the healthcare that's provided to them. We can also talk about how to avoid ambiguity in a situation involving interpretation. Frequently unasked questions, please do not abbreviate that, about the relationship between cultural awareness and safety. If you guys have any questions, I would, or suggestions, I would really appreciate that. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to these two children that I had mentioned in my talk earlier, Jacqueline Caal Maquin and Felipe Gomez Alonso. They are indigenous Guatemalan migrant children who died while in custody of the United States Border Patrol. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming, for being here with us. And I'm looking forward to your suggestions, comments, questions, etc. Thanks a lot. Oh, I'd like to thank, of course, April and the Office of Diversity and the Hopkins Familia and so forth.
Great. job, Eduardo. Very engaging, per usual.
Hey, thank you. For a second there, I thought I was talking all to myself.
Oh no, it was a great talk. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, the chat box, and I'll ask them to Eduardo for him to answer. So the first question we had is, what do you think of the term Latinx?
I knew that that question was going to come up. Honestly, I like it. I know that many people my age and up, do not like it. They think it goes against the spirit of the Spanish language. I just read something about this today. They said it was in Quora, right? It's like, oh, it's easy to say it in English, but in Spanish it wouldn't work out. So what's the point in even having this word? I'll tell you why. First of all, no, it's not that hard to say it in Spanish. It rhymes with dos X, Latinx, dos X. It rhymes, right? So I think that linguistic argument can be eliminated right there. And there is, of course, people tend to be very conservative when it comes to their language. And people living in a foreign country, they tend to be a little even more. They're like, oh no, let's not not allow English to mess up our language because we already have too many influences. We're trying to hold on and cherish our culture, so let's not that happen. I think languages adapt. They change according to new circumstances, and I think it's something that people have just to get used to. They don't have to use it. It's not obligatory, but I think it helps. I'll give you an example. Every time I'm working from home, some of the days, right, interpreting over the phone, and when somebody mentions a doctor, I tend to ask, is that a male or a female doctor? And then I have to explain, look, I'm not being sexist. It's just that to explain to the patient, if it's a doctor or doctora, I need to know the gender of the person in advance. Because imagine if you're giving, some information to a patient and you say, the doctor said that you need to do this and that, right? And then you, interpreter, say, el doctor dijo que usted tiene que hacer eso. And then the patient may say, weird, because I didn't see any doctor. I saw a doctora, So that's why I asked those questions in advance. It's a feature of the Spanish language. We cannot fight it all the time. But if people come up with solutions, hey, please do it. But I have to admit that because I'm not a native speaker of the language, I don't have a dog in the fight. But I used to be much more conservative about Portuguese as well. But if there is one thing you learn when you were at a certain age is that languages will change and they will not send you the memo. The new generations will change it. And it's usually, in this case specifically, I think it's a good development.
Great. And then a follow-up question was, do you know where Latinx came from, the term?
Oh man, that's an excellent question. I don't know. Actually, I don't. I think, the X thing has a lot to do with, unidentified, right? It's either one or the other, but that's a very good question. I should investigate that more. I know that, for instance, Hispanic people that I correspond with, and even, Spanish speakers also, they tend to use the @ sign, the arroba sign, to avoid, there's no X. So when I say, for example, dear amigos, I can say, dear amigex, I can say, dear amigos with the @ sign because it's an A, but it's also surrounded by an O. So if you think of it, the arroba sign kind of works as both letters. And I've seen people using E as a sign of neutral gender. So instead of amigo, amiga, it's amigue or amigues. So there are all sorts of solutions that people are coming up with, and it's normal because the language is changing. We are adapting to new circumstances, and it's the kind of linguistic changes that signals the willingness of having social progress as well. It's not just out of vanity or out of being cute. No, people are seeking a way of making justice, making a more just world. And if that implies changing the language, go ahead. In Latin American countries, now that we finally have presidents who are women, we can say presidenta. But the opposition to those women thought that that was terrible. That's not how the language is. It's presidente. Presidente is more than enough. No, now we have presidentas, thank God. So let's cherish that. And if the language needs to change, let's welcome the changes, right?
Yeah, I'm also not familiar with the history of Latinx, but I love the Latinx because when we think about intersectionality and the LGBT plus Latino community, because there are many Latinos who are queer and gay and lesbian and questioning. And so when you don't know, it's really comfortable to have that Latinx. So I don't know what my gender is right now, and so I'm Latinx instead of saying I'm Latino or Latina. And so I think it's very inclusive of the LGBTQ community, and I thought it was an advancement towards that. So I was a fan of the Latinx.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and I don't see people being so much opposed to any other Anglicismos that enter Spanish and Portuguese. But when it comes to this, people tend to be a little passionate about it, and I think they put in their energy towards something more productive.
Yeah. So our next question was, how can someone get involved with Hopkins Familia? And so I will answer that one.
Yes, please.
If you want to get involved with Hopkins Familia, you can just shoot me an email. I'll drop it in the chat box for everyone. And I can provide you with more information. We have, let me know if you want to be in a leadership role or you just want to be a part of the committee. It's a great organization, and we are a familia. Wilson, who's my coach, has, become one of my best friends. So I really encourage you to come out and join. Then the following question is, from your experience, Eduardo, are Indigenous group feelings different or segregated from the non-Indigenous Latin American groups, even in the US, where we're all underrepresented minorities?
I think within those communities, they're still perceived as being different, and again, I have to rely on anecdotic evidences that are from anecdotes. For instance, I worked with a patient who was of Mayan descent. He spoke a Mayan language, and he said that at the construction site where he was the foreman, so he was the boss of most people, people would get mad at him and call him, Indio, but in a pejorative way, and say, why are you think you're so cool, but you only learned Spanish after you moved to the US, So there is internal discrimination. I've noticed, for instance, because I'm very nosy, because I'm a linguist and I'm very curious about things. So if you overhear people speaking an indigenous language, and you ask them, what are you speaking? Many times they'll say, I was just speaking Spanish, because they don't want to admit. But at the same time, many times when you give them the opening to show pride in their culture, they'll say, it's Mixteco. The first time I noticed somebody speaking a language that at first I thought it was Spanish, and then I realized that it wasn't, was a speaker of Pipil from El Salvador. He was in a public payphone, which, that shows age, right? He was on a payphone outside of 7-Eleven, and I had the curiosity of asking him, what language are you speaking? Pipil. So Pipil is one of those languages that's very endangered, because there was an episode in El Salvador that led to the massacre of many Pipil people, and much of their population and their language died because of that. So I think most non-Spanish speaking people don't notice the difference, and that's why I thought it was important to bring awareness to this. But within the communities, I think people noticed when somebody's not a native speaker of Spanish, somebody's from a certain part of the country that's typically associated with indigenous people, and the same prejudices that you have down there, you can't help it but bring them here as well. So we have to be aware of that, because we may be dealing with a population that it's disenfranchised within a disenfranchised population, a minority within a minority.
We have a comment that's not really a question, but somebody mentioned that in Asian culture, there is Tiger Balm, which is apparently used as Vick's Vaporub is used in the Latino community. And so it's interesting to see how different cultures have similar items.
Yeah.
Great. I think that was the last question. Anyone else have any questions, burning questions they want to ask before the presentation's over and we have Eduardo? I see a comment that 35,000 people were killed in 3 days by Yoni. What was that in El Salvador?
Yep. You're talking about the Pipil? Yes, I'll tell you something. If you ever Google, and beware that the results may be very sad, but if you ever Google the word matanza, you're going to see that there were massacres in so many different Latin American countries, and they tended to target indigenous people. Guatemala was one of them, and El Salvador, like Yoni said, another one. Just recently, I think it was a few years ago, Pope Francis canonized a priest from El Salvador who died at the hands of the military during a dictatorship, Oscar Romero, you know, uh, and he was just one of countless people who died at those circumstances. And the thing is that it's still happening. It just doesn't become news, especially not in the US. I remember when things were going terribly in Bolivia and in Chile, you would turn your radio, you wouldn't hear anything about it. It's like, those people's lives didn't matter, and that's happening all the time. And sometimes, the fact that they are here, that could be used as that's more than enough reason to raise awareness on the situation back in our original countries. Thank you, Yoni, for mentioning that.
And so I heard a question that we are gonna share the slides after the presentation. So if you register, you'll get a copy of the slide deck. Pablo mentioned that in Japan, there are parts of Japan that speak Spanish.
Oh.
And then another question for Eduardo. When you are interpreting for parents of a child, are there any turns of phrase or other approaches you use so as to uplift the indigenous languages instead of inadvertently drawing unwanted attention and shame?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. When there are communication difficulties, I always ask about that, if they would prefer having an interpreter in their language. But I know how difficult it is to get one. And one thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that there are some special situations in which having an interpreter in person is essential. And one of them is when you're working with people whose native language is not Spanish. Usually, because of my training as an anthropologist, and it's something that comes from my heart, I tend to, every time I talk about indigenous languages and cultures, I talk with positivity. And I brag about the fact that I learned to speak a language from the Brazilian Amazon, even though probably I cannot speak it anymore because I haven't spoken it in such a long time. And I show true interest in their culture, in their language, usually under normal circumstances. There are not many communication barriers. It's under emotional distress. It's under certain situations in which the patient just cannot communicate too well in Spanish. I mean, imagine all of us, right, who are not native speakers of English, having to, under very stressful situations, making life or death decisions, and we have to do it in a language that's not ours. That may be difficult, if you're going through some cognitive issues because of an accident, not being able to have somebody who speaks your language, that may be difficult as well. I've worked with a patient. The thing of being a medical interpreter is that you're there for very happy moments. We've been through countless deliveries, and but we've been there at the very, very last breath of patients. And I remember one specific woman that I will never forget. She was a Mayan woman from Guatemala, and she had a very, very painful history of abuse and all. So I was the one called to give her the bad news that contrary to what she was thinking, she's not going to leave that hospital. And it's a matter of days, not weeks. And I remember I explained to her everything in Spanish as carefully as I could. And I could see that she was very sad and she was shocked. But it was when her sister told her in her language that she lost it. So you can reach people intellectually sometimes, but only their native language will reach them emotionally, So yes, that's an excellent question, because most of the times, just because somebody is not a native speaker of Spanish, like for instance, most of the patients we work with who are from Ecuador, who speak Kichwa, I'm sorry, they do super, super well in Spanish. Remember that most of the services, government services, are provided in Spanish, so they have to deal with Spanish whether they want it or not. So they speak you know, think about anyone who speaks 2 languages and sometimes even 3 languages, and you know that's something that it's an achievement, and you don't want to over exaggerate their language difficulties, because they're doing a good communication job. It should be always their option, you know, to decide whether they want to use an interpreter from their native language or not. Most of them won't even suggest that. Most of them will do it really well. But I remember once over the phone, I was working with this lady, and it was going well. But you know, you just have to be a little more repetitive. The same way when you're speaking with anyone whose native language is not English, right? Patience and making sure you check for comprehension every all through the process, you know, to make sure there's no misunderstandings. And they can, one thing that we do a lot at Bayview is to ask them to repeat back what the instructions were. And usually that shows if there are gaps in communication or not. So it's just being more careful, making sure you're there, you know, because if you're there in presence, you can look at mannerisms, you know, body language and so forth, and that will help a lot. So, you know, not overestimated, but not underestimated either. So we have to navigate that. But that's indeed an excellent question. Oh, that lady I was working over the phone, just one thing. I said, ma'am, for future reference, would you like your files to show that you would prefer a Kichwa speaker? And then she's like, oh, no sería lindo. Like, wouldn't it be beautiful? Oh yes, it would be beautiful. But she's like, no, pero español está bien. And it's okay. So she's like, oh yeah. But at the same time, you know, she can do well in Spanish. And most of them can do well in Spanish if you bear in mind that you need to be a little more careful, because of course there will be situations in which you may have communication issues, especially if it's over the phone, especially if you're not careful enough. And I'm proud to say that our team, are very careful when it comes to that. And it's because we got to know our community.
So our next question is, someone asked if you would know if Kichwa is influenced by Asia.
Oh, that's an excellent question. It has been discussed forever, right? My opinion as a linguist who deals with South American linguistics in general, the short answer is no. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but there were hypotheses of relationship between languages from South America, from the Americas in general, with the Asian language. And of course, it's a good hypothesis, because at the end, that's where all indigenous people came from, right? Through Siberia. There are, you know, hypotheses that the people came from Polynesia, but the evidence is just very slim that there were any contacts. Of course, Polynesians arrived close enough to the, you know, the Easter Island, and there were evidence that they exchanged sweet potatoes with people on the coast of Peru or Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Chile, one of those countries. But that's where it ends, you know. So the most robust hypothesis is that everyone came through Siberia in 3 different waves. The first one is the one that populated the entire continent, and then the ancestors of the Nadene, I think the Navajo are part of them, came second, and then finally the ancestors of the Inuit people, you know, which I think people don't call them Eskimo anymore, because originally it was a bad word. Yes, but the ancestors of the Inuit. And we know that because there's 2 people from that language family on both sides of the Bering Strait. But no, there are similarities that are coincidences, you know, but that's basically it. And another thing, you know, that I like to point out, it's something that we need to try to avoid, that when you're talking about the greatest accomplishments of European civilization, nobody doubts it was Europeans who built it. Nobody says it was extraterrestrials, you know, but you hear that a lot, like, oh, those monumental walls in Peru, extraterrestrials. Oh, those beautiful pyramids in Egypt, those Africans couldn't have done it. And the same thing happens in Latin America, you know. And for example, that's why I find the history of the decipherment of the Mayan writing system so fascinating, is that it shows a lot of prejudice that needed to be fought against. You know, it's the idea that that writing system is not a full-fledged writing system, you know, and that idea prevailed for a couple of centuries. And finally, it was determined that no, it was a full-fledged writing system representing the languages spoken by those same people who are still there to this day. So another thing is, just because a civilization collapses, the people are still there. They don't vanish, you know. The same people who were inhabiting those areas in Guatemala and Mexico, Honduras, Belize, and so forth, they descend from the people who built those pyramids, the people who wrote those hieroglyphs, I mean, those glyphs, and they're still there. You know, they speak language that descend directly from those languages. And we should recognize that and really admire these people for still being around, because the way they were treated by the colonizer and by the descendants of the colonizers throughout the centuries was just terrible. Just recently in Mexico, the Institute of Archaeology in Mexico discovered the shipwreck of a boat on the coast of Mexico, on the Gulf of Mexico, that carried Mayan slaves, indigenous Mayan slaves to Cuba to work the sugarcane plantation. So, you know, and those things, they leave a mark, you know, and every time I see one of those indigenous people, I think, my God, thank you for being here, you know, because it was tough. It was a tough path, but you made it. And I have indigenous blood as well. I have, of course, African blood, and I'm very proud of that, you know. But I still, because I'm just a member of the general Brazilian population, I won't take credit for their resiliency. That's all theirs, you know. And many times people say, also claim indigenous ancestry just to say, well, you know, look at me. My great-grandmother, and that's something that happens in the US, happens in Brazil, it happens everywhere. Everybody has a great-grandmother who was an indigenous princess. I said, wow, this was a very democratic monarchy, because everybody was princesses. There were no, you know, regular people. Everybody descends from princesses. And it's a way of, unfortunately, even though you may be saying it with pride, you know, that's where I'm coming from. If you don't put your actions where your mouth is, if you're not using that, you know, ancestry to defend current indigenous people, you're not doing much. You know, you're just using that to legitimize the fact that you are in their ancestral lands, without doing anything for those who are still around. You know, so I think that's also important to keep in mind.
I think we have one question, unless somebody wants to type one quickly. Could you comment about Costa Rica and their indigenous people as communities as well?
See, yeah, there are many indigenous communities still who speak their language in Costa Rica, and they tend to be linguistically related to South American groups. I don't know much about it, because that's where my expertise is South American languages, and what I learned about the other groups is after I started working with them at Bayview, and we don't get Costa Ricans much, you know. During my entire time working at Bayview, actually working as an interpreter for more than a decade, I may have had maybe 2 or 3 patients from Costa Rica. So it's not an area in which I'm very familiar with. But because they're like very close to the isthmus, is that how you pronounce that word? It's very hard for me to pronounce that word. But the isthmo, they have a lot of influence from South American groups, from Colombia and so forth. So linguistically, many of them are considered more South American than Central American. The same way, again, going back to the Garífuna, they speak a South American language rather than a Central American one. I think, I don't know if you saw this comment by Wilson. He said, what things can we do to help improve interpretation across Hopkins? Do you see that?
Oh, I totally missed that one. Good catch.
Oh, yeah. So if you don't mind, I would say, well, you know, from a purely Bayview point of view, I think more of the same. You know, make sure interpreters will be available when people need them, especially under very special circumstances when you're dealing with people who knowledge of Spanish is not satisfactory. You know, it's not only emotionally comforting, but it can also have some, you know, important consequences on the quality of the healthcare. And I think being aware of those differences is a major step. You know, when I started working as an interpreter, one thing that was very recurrent when I would arrive at the location, you know, that's way before I started working for Bayview, was the comment, "Hey, I'm so glad you're here, interpreter, because this patient, he doesn't seem to be all there, you know." And then you work with the patient and you realize that, no, cognitively, he's better than me. And maybe better than you, who's calling him cognitively incompetent. It's just that sometimes people are just overwhelmed. Sometimes people are just not used to those situations, you know, and you have to take that into consideration as well. We've had patients that I've worked with at Bayview. They've been in the US for a couple weeks. Imagine the transition is not easy, and that's something that I think it's important mentioning. Many of our patients, they went through a lot just to get here, and then when they get here, you know, they may go through even more. Many of our patients have undiagnosed PTSD because the reasons why they left their countries were not just to seek a better job or a PhD in linguistics, you know. They came because their lives were threatened back then, because they underwent abuse in the hands of, you know, authorities and, you know, other people in their country. So they come through a very dangerous migration to get here, to get a better life, and especially to guarantee that their children won't have to go through that. So we need to bear that in mind too. We need to be aware of that, that many patients went through things that we can only imagine. And it is a large proportion of the patients we work with. And now, you know, the more you read the news, like I said, I don't have to mention explicitly everything, but the situation with immigration enforcement, for instance, what, you know, the news that just came out recently about people's reproductive rights being disrespected, you know, taken away from them by people in a jail, or people who are catching coronavirus in highest rates than anyone else because they keep on being moved from one jail to another one. That's what our immigrants are going through too. So we have to bear all of that in mind. We have to take all that into consideration, because one thing that I love about working at Bayview, at Johns Hopkins, is that people really care. You know, I've seen, you know, providers and everyone else going out of their ways to make sure people get the health care they deserve. So I think the more knowledge we can get to know more and more about these patients, the best. Thank you, Camelia, for your comment.
Yeah, Camilla said having in-person interpretation is critical. There are very sensitive psychosocial situations that arise that we face daily that require personal touch, in her opinion, and the worthiness is immeasurable. Thank you for that comment. It was really nice. Great. And so we're out of questions and comments, and this was a great presentation, Eduardo. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this
Thank
presentation.
you, guys. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for everyone who came. And thank you guys for being my colleagues. You know, I mean, I think interpreters and everybody else do a very good job together, you know, and let's keep on doing that.
All right, thanks. Now I'll be ending the session then.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Adios.